All right, welcome folks. Welcome back to the students that are part of the open class, and welcome to the folks who know about this conversation, this unscripted experimental work of study and conversation and dialogue through the On Violence experimental study sequence that is in its second iteration. I want to welcome my longtime colleague, my longtime teacher, my longtime comrade, Professor Shana Redmond. Who I've come to know in so many different ways, but I will say that she's always been so generous and insistent in inviting me into her classroom. So, so we know each other in all kinds of different ways, but I want to say that I know Shauna in a very particular kind of way as a co-conspirator and collaborator in the classroom space. And so this is a long overdue opportunity to return the favor. Um,
Appreciate that.
and I'm looking forward to it. And I will also say that Shauna is also somebody who I consider to be the kind of scholar who is willing to do the magic of experimentation by way of actually making art all the time. Um, I'll say that one of the many memorable and I think indelible impressions that she's made on a lot of us was through the poetry of the announcement of the annual theme for the American Studies Association when she was president. Um, the roof is on fire. Y'all look it up, right? But just to see the levels of art, and also I was there when Shauna first got the theremin. Shauna actually has a theremin. If y'all remember from the tail end of the book, that thing blew my mind when I saw it sitting in the living room. I did not understand what it was, and Shauna had to explain it. And I still have yet to enjoy a solo piece from you on that, Dr. Redmond, but that's still to come. I hope you still have that piece. So this is
Yeah.
my very unconventional introduction of my good friend and colleague, Shana Redmond. Thank you for giving us this book. The first hour and a half of this class that preceded this event was a group of about 40 students talking about it. So we're going to start by having a set of questions and um, ideas and challenges coming from that group, and then I'd love to open it up to the larger audience that's come through for the On Violence study sequence, and we'll go from there. As always, it's unscripted. Please use the chat robustly, you all. If you will, do me the favor of please raising your Zoom digital hand or DM me if you want to get in the queue to make to raise something and come off mute and raise a point. I want to start with B because B has to leave a little bit early today. But B was going to draw some connections that thought about Rutgers and maybe can kickstart us into thinking about the work you did as an as both an archival scholar and an archive making scholar, maybe something like that. Anyway, go ahead, B.
Yes, first of all, thank you for joining us. I'm Bea Pearson. I'm a second year in the Rutgers History Department. I'm Dr. Alexander's advisee, actually. So hopefully my question is decent enough to do her justice. Um, I was kind of thinking about, you mentioned like McCarthyism a few times in your book. And as I grew up in Jersey, actually, I'm a South Jersey girl, and I now go to grad school here. And I think about how Paul Robeson, I think we kind of narrativize the way that like McCarthyism put him under siege, but people don't talk about how he was a proponent of communism in actuality. And I guess I was just wondering if we're going to kind of orient it around the archive, how you encountered intellectual McCarthyism in the materials that like surround his legacy and his work, and how you can like write about, and how maybe it was difficult to write about his positive relationship to communism and not just the negative relationship.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I haven't heard that phrased in that way, intellectual McCarthyism. I think there is still a lot of censorship that attends to archival practices, certainly the ways in which people utilize the archives. There are just pieces of his papers and his trace that people don't want to deal with, right? Because it's too messy, it's too complicated for the kinds of stories that we want to be telling about him, which is either as a hero victim of the Cold War era, or as someone whose kind of extraordinary talents somehow are suspended above any kind of concrete material political engagement, neither of which are true, right? He was someone who was very much committed to ground level mobilizations. He was an organizer. And part of what I wanted to insist upon was precisely that fact by attending robustly to what I was encountering in the archives. And there were multiple of them, right? He appears all over the place. And this, again, was part of the impetus or the motivation for even getting into this project, is because I was encountering him everywhere. I was researching other things and he was still popping up in other people's papers, in contemporary art exhibits, all of these places. So he's everywhere in a certain respect, but nowhere at the same time. And I think Rutgers is a perfect example of that. He's all over that campus, but until very recently, right, he was not installed properly such that you would actually pause in kind of engagement with who this person was or the impact that he's had on this place and on the world surrounding it. So I think there was quite a bit of censure. And part of that, you know, having gotten to know the Robeson family in the last couple of years, some of that I can understand when it's at their hand, right? That they want to protect him even in death, knowing that the kinds of political siege that attends to leftist thought and action still continues to this very day. They want to protect him from those kinds of assaults, especially recognizing, again, how remarkably present he is, the student centers and schools that are named for him, for example, right, in order to protect against the erasure, defunding, all of those things of those monuments to his influence. They have made certain choices about how they want him represented in the archives that they might have some influence over, but certainly in the stories that they tell about him. So his son, being one of his biographers, did not really talk about his communism. His granddaughter, who has written a children's book about him and does a lot of speaking engagements and represents the family at the honorifics for his life, doesn't talk about his communism, right? And I think I understand that. I think I understand that, right? Even as I think that also does a disservice to the ways in which he was showing up in the world and the incredible courage and bravery and integrity with which he lived his life, right? There's this line of his that I use in the hologram chapter that I love, and it's just jammed in my head around his political beliefs, right? There's both a quote of him saying, you know, that he didn't change his political beliefs like the weather. He was not raised that way, right? But then in continuance of that thought, that he was immovable to 1,000th of an inch. Like his politics were immovable to 1,000th of an inch. And it's a stinging kind of reveal about how he understood himself and his need to dig in and to stay firm and grow where he was planted politically. So I think that as much latitude and sympathy as I want to offer, it does make the work then of telling this story of this person, even as clear as he was about who he was and what he believed, it does make it that much more difficult for me to try and tell that story, because so many others have told it otherwise or have completely elided the question of his socialist investments. And to be clear, right, he represented himself as a democratic socialist, right? So even as he's going through the inquisition from the House Un-American Activities Committee and refusing, pleading the fifth in answer to the question, are you now have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? He is identifying in other ways what he believes and what his investments are. And so I tried to follow his lead as precisely as possible and to read between portions of the archive, things that showed up that I hadn't seen anyone else engage with, places that I looked for him that others had not sought out, but also just through different forms of interpretation, bringing different kinds of meaning to some of the more well-worked elements of his archive and history as well, that, I think going through graduate programs and things, folks will tell you there's nothing new under the sun, right? So you're doing this work following in the footsteps of so many other people, and that's absolutely true. But I think interpretation still matters. And there are ways in which the kinds of frames that we use to understand the material such as it currently exists, or the literature such as it currently exists, can be innovative and can be wildly curious in ways that bring entirely new dimension to what we think we already know. So that was my effort. And to be really clear about how revered he was. And, one of the people who showed up to most assist me with that, or one of the people who jumps out at me most in that effort, was Ozzie Davis, actually, who was a mentor of, or a mentee, excuse me, of Robeson, and who wrote about him, eulogized him, continued to call his name for years, decades after his passing, and gave a lot of language to me, loving, passionate language to me about who this person was and what he meant to the movements that with which both of them were affiliated. And so it's not like I had to invent the wheel, right? I was actually just allowing other people to speak in ways that they had not had the opportunity. So it's there. It's all there.
I think one of our three co-facilitators, Mao, has a great way to kind of seg into a continuity with what you were just thinking through, which has to do with the break from biography. Mao, go ahead.
Great, thank you, Shana, for this book and for joining us, for your time. Yeah, something that we were talking about. You kind of started to answer it a few times already. I think in your previous response, but given that you're very clear, right, up front about what you're trying to do and what you're not trying to do with this book, right, and sort of breaking with conventional biography, right, and making this more of a of a collective accounting, right, and accounting for all of the multiple communities and commitments that Robeson was a part of, right, and accountable to. Um, uh, you know, I was just curious how and why you chose to tackle this through the figure, right, of Paul Robeson, given that, a lot of I think the traps that you're trying to avoid, right, with um, writing the book in the way that you did and not as a conventional biography is sort of the tendency to um, idealize individuals, which then, right, can have the effect of really isolating them from the communities and the struggles that they're a part of, right, and making it seem like regular folks are not part of changing history. And so then it seemed to me such a uh, such a difficult task, right, to take such an extraordinary person with such unwavering and clear commitments in politics, and to write about them and not fall into that trap, right? So maybe a little bit, I guess, about the genesis maybe of the book, like why this book, why Paul Robeson, given that, right, you're not trying to do just that one amazing individual, right? But so that was the question.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the genesis of the project was, again, me being in study around a whole other project. I was writing a book that I will finish eventually, but has been displaced again and again and again and again. I was writing a book about aid regimes and songs like We Are the World. And so was just kind of listening promiscuously, as I'm wont to do, and continuing to just engage in kind of a broader arts curiosity and practice. And like I mentioned, I kept running into him. I kept finding him in the poetry I was reading. I went to an exhibition. Hank Willis Thomas had an exhibition in LA maybe 6 or 8 years ago that I attended, and he was showing up in the artwork there. I just kept bumping into him. And it just so happens that the chapter that I wrote about him in Anthem, he, from that research, was my favorite muse. He was the character in that story that was of most interest to me. And I loved everybody in that book, but he was the one who leapt out to me. But I had no investment in returning to him, certainly not in any long form way. But because he kept showing up, I wanted to slow down and try to think about why and how he was coming back to me. And so I started then being a little bit more active in my curiosity and seeking out those moments, whether it be kind of an honorific or a building that was named after him. I knew he was relatively well preserved or institutionalized in Berlin, and thinking about all of these global dimensions as well. And I was just finding more and more and more evidence of his recurrence, of his repetition, and of his need. That is what it signaled to me, that we still need him. And that we was significant, right? The we being leftist movements, we being minoritized communities. Why do we still call his name? And is he responding to us? And that then becomes kind of the foundation for this antiphonal life, right? That we're calling him and he's responding. So that's how I came to the project, was just a constant encounter and me wanting to have me in my fidelity to him, wanting to take that opportunity to listen to him. What are you trying to tell me? And so I very much felt like I was writing this project with him, like he was sitting right here with me as I was telling this story. And everything I knew and know of him is that he did not understand himself to be an exceptional individual. Every speech he gave, every interview he offered, where people try to pull him away from his communities to talk about how fantastic an artist or a thinker or an orator he is, he's always bringing the attention back to his communities, whether it be to the organization or the union that he's there to support, or to the other cast and crew of the film he's just made, or whatever, right? He's always drawing attention back to the radical whole. And so then it made sense to me that I think about this project not as the story of an exceptional man, even as the title suggests as much, right? I do believe he was exceptional, but he was not exceptional in distinction to what he already knew of his communities, right? He believed that he was a product of all of this talent, of all of this thought, of all of this struggle that made him who he was. And so I wanted to work towards a structuring of the story that would allow for that to continue to be his story, that the story he would tell of himself continued to be the one that I was then picking up and trying to move into the present. So that line in the introduction where I say that he's less subject than opportunity is really at the heart of my not biography. So I say in the introduction that this is not a biography, but if I rewrote that, I'd say it's not a biography. On the one hand, I'm trying to tell these stories that I think need to be part of our broad biography of knowing this person, that, related to the first question, there are things that we just don't talk enough about. And I think his voice is one of those things. So the focus on his voice as the kind of animating evidence of his recurrence was really central to me in telling this story. But it's also not a biography. I'm not interested in telling a linear story. I'm not interested in removing him anymore from his communities. I want to leave him there. That's where he felt most secure. And that's where he made all of his interventions. None of this would have been possible without those communities, and he was clear about that. So I had to kind of make that statement. I kind of begrudgingly wrote that in the introduction because as I was workshopping this project in the final stages, I would occasionally get questions like, well, this sounds like it's bordering on hagiography. And do you agree, Dylan?
No, we're going to come back to that. We have
Okay.
people have questions about that.
Okay.
We'll come back to it.
All right. Well, I'll wait on that comment then. But yes, the book, and this relationship to biography then in my effort to demonstrate that it's not that. That was also part of the thinking in how the 4 chapters are organized, right? They're organized by these broad kind of thematics of play and things like that, because it's not about a period of life. It's not about a relationship to another singular individual. It's about how he manifested in the world and how he came back.
Thank you. That was really great. Katie, jump in. The Katie had a couple things that were linked, and just I feel like we could actually organize a seminar around Katie's questions, but I'm gonna make sure she raises them here anyways, and just hope that you can think through them with us.
Yeah, I'm gonna try to keep it like tight. So I loved the book, and I felt like we talked about it a little bit the hour before, of like it feels like it was experimental in nature. And so there's a couple things that were brought up about like voice not being singular, it's a collective. There was this focus on this like recentering the F-sharp epistemology, interconnectedness of struggle. A lot of these, and then how Robeson used his voice like scientist and using the scientific method. I think all of those things, as I was reading it, it felt like you were leaving breadcrumbs into how Robeson might have identified or saw himself. And so my question to you is, was Robeson a humanist? And so that's the first part of the question. So, and you could answer it from like whether you believe he was a humanist, whether he believed at that time that he was a humanist, like all of that. And then another part, I just don't want you to forget it. I had another question around just his availability. There's a lot that you talk about Robeson's presence and how he made, I think, quote, himself available. And I was like, I want to aspire to be something like that, like being available. But I'm curious of like how tiring and exhausting that could be, and just how is he made available? And I know you can talk through about how he's like still living or living beyond death, or we can go into that. But I'm curious, or his voice being not temporal or extratemporal. But I'm curious of like even just physically how he was making himself available. So the two-parter is like, was Robeson a humanist? Do you believe it? Do you think he believed it at the time? And then how was he always available? Thank you.
What do you mean by humanist?
I sort of mean like, so you brought up like the human, or just like his like search for just interconnectedness, and like you saw the interconnectedness of struggle, especially the interconnectedness of people who were struggling, the organized labor struggles, and even like with apartheid, et cetera. So like people who are oppressed, or I think you even had a quote about like his voice being in the third world. I hope that was not like me making that up, but I remember there being a quote about his voice being centered or in the third world.
Yeah.
And so I think what I mean by humanist is, did he see that there was this sort of like universal equality of shared struggle, and sort of seeing this as like, was he connected more to like it transcending race, transcending class, like, did he see it that way? Or so that is what I mean by humanist, and I might not have the best definition. So someone else here might have a better definition of what humanist is. I guess that's sort of my question. So my question is like, did he see this interconnectedness that sort of transcended race, transcended time, transcended like, so just sort of this universal, like, principled, maybe that's another word, principled based off of our humanity, not so much like race first or class first or.
Yeah, I will say yes, but. So I'll say yes, he was a humanist. I think the language kind of applied to him as he was receiving commendation and awards and recognition, particularly from kind of established state craft actors and things such as that, as humanitarian, right? That he was kind of a radical humanitarian in his efforts to kind of unite the struggles of the dispossessed. So I think, yes, there's kind of a formal quality to that, and one that is applicable. The but is that I don't want to tell a story about him in which the kinds of conditions that differentiate the struggles of oppressed peoples are disintegrated. He was very clear about the disadvantage for Black and Brown people, particularly in the global South. He spent a lot of time studying and paying attention to laboring conditions in South Africa, for example, right? That he was drawing attention to kind of the genocidal practices that were facing Maori people in the South Pacific and indigenous Aboriginal peoples in Australia, even at the very end of his career. Like, he was very clear about the kind of differing conditions of those communities with whom he worked, but they were all in concert, like a beautifully radical concert with one another, such that he could have a 40-year career with the miners in South Wales while also paying lifetime attention to the conditions of African descended peoples, formerly enslaved peoples, right? That all of these things went together for him. And I think this too was part of the thinking of the F-sharp epistemology. All of these cultures are working from the pentatonic scale, right? It's beyond the Western European kind of musical tradition. All of these other cultures are united by similar ways of hearing. And for him, those ways of hearing were ways of knowing. And so he saw himself in the folk traditions of peoples all over the world, all over the world. And that's why he would sing in dozens of languages, because he understood those struggles and those cultures to be deeply, profoundly connected to one another. So yes, he was a humanist in that way, but not with a kind of colorblind ethic. That was never his investment. And class was very much at the forefront of what he was invested in and what he was concerned with, because he wanted to understand and bring to the center of discussion, political discussion, the conditions of laboring people, because that is what people do all over the world. They labor. And from that labor, there's exploitation. So how do we actually create systems of redress and adjustment such that we then allow for these dispossessed peoples to repossess those spaces that are naturally, rightfully theirs, right? Not only recuperate their own labor power, but recuperate the spaces in which they labor, those lands on which they live and labor. So he was really clear about all of this stuff, even as he was very much committed to drawing into conversation all of these different communities. And he lived that way, right? This is not just a flex for him in being able to speak 24 languages. It was urgent for him. That was a part of his organizing, was to be able to speak to people in their native language. And sing to them in that language, because his voice was his primary offering, and he knew that. So yes, in that way, he is a radical humanist and was deeply cosmopolitan before it was something that could be commodified, and was profoundly dedicated to those peoples and to the idea of a global South. So when I mention his voice in the Third World, that is the recording that he sends to the Bandung Conference in 1955. That's his voice in the Third World, but it's also his voice in South Africa, where he's on the list of banned Americans, right? It's also his voice in South Wales when he can't travel because his passport has been seized, right? All of these things. So yes, and I think I know that not just by him telling me or telling us in his speeches, but by what others are requesting of him that he cannot fulfill. I know that he's those things to those people because they're asking him to come and he can't, for whatever reason, right? I know these things because the people are building monuments to him. I know these things because the people are playing his voice at epic gatherings, political gatherings and mobilizations. I know these things because people still put him on their money, on their stamps, right? I know these things because of those evidences. So yes, and The second question, I'm sorry for all of that. You even repeated it to me and I lost it.
How was Robeson always available? How was he
Oh,
not tired and wearied?
he was tired and weary. I mean, think about, I asked this question early in the introduction somewhere, I think. Imagine the energy it takes to vibrate over an entire lifetime, right? And he had a 40-year career, almost 50 years of singing to and for people. And like I say at various points, if you asked him to sing, he would sing. He's getting off the airplane and people ask him to sing, he'll sing. He's retired and trying to live very, very quietly at his sister's home in Philadelphia, which is now the Paul Robeson home. So the person who asked about who's been there, I've been there multiple times. He's trying to live quietly in that home, and a neighbor visits and asks him to please sing. He sings, right? I think it was both about the incredible wear and tear that he put on his body, constantly traveling, both domestically and abroad, but it was also about the kinds of opportunities that he selected for himself, such that he might be able to reach as broad a group of people at any given moment as possible, right? So the kinds of films he was choosing to make, or the kinds of concerts he was choosing to give, right? The peak skill moment in 1949, where he's first deterred due to white supremacist mob violence, but then promises to return a week later, and he does, and thousands upon thousands of people gather to hear him sing. Or when he sings in 1952 over the US-Canadian border, and 30,000 people on the Canadian side alone show up to hear him sing over the border in defiance of the US state. Like, he was both promiscuous in his agreement to perform, right? If you asked him, he would do it, but then he was also really calculated at certain moments too, about where can my energy best be put so that I can reach the most people and bring the most effect to whatever cause it is that I'm there in support of. Because there are very few moments that I engage with, certainly, but that become kind of hallmarks of his career that are not attached to a social justice issue, right? His concert at Carnegie Hall, yeah, there's an album of it, there's a recording of it, but it is not what people kind of iconize as indicative of his vocal promise and performance practice. It's all of these other moments, and all of these other moments are attached to questions of justice, what's right in the world. So I think for that to be his legacy says everything about how he makes himself available and the ethic behind the work that he was doing. So yeah, he was exhausted, and I don't go into it much in the book. But he not only suffered with kind of physical ailment, but also mental health issues, particularly at the very end of his life. Struggled very, very strenuously and fought robustly against depression. And we can understand why, right? He saw too much, he knew too much, and he did too much.
As I pass the mic to Jazz, who's our third co-facilitator out of three folks today, I do want to say how listening to the dialogue you just had with Katie makes me think about how Robeson's multivocality, his multilingualism, his vibration, as you put it, as far as I'm concerned, confounds the terms of what academics have been calling fugitivity. By thinking in the terms of the actual genealogy of fugitivity.
Yeah.
And at the same time, what Robeson has given as a kind of gift by way of his suffering and exhaustion and illness, for that matter, is a revelation of how the state engages in its own experiments of capture to try to figure how the fuck to contain and neutralize that fugitivity, meaning the fugitivity of the multivocality, of the vibration, all these things that that signify the totality of diasporic Black fugitivity.
Right.
which has everything to do with physical escape and insurrection, and everything to do with vibration, multivocality, and and multilingualism.
Right.
From
Right. But they can
yeah,
only wrap their minds around the body, right? At
that's
least
right.
at this moment.
That's
So
right.
his revocation was meant to be the period on
That's
that
right.
sentence that he's done and over with, when in fact that could not have been farther from the case. And so, again, this moment of reinterpretation around this 50 to 58 period of his career. What does he do with those 8 years when he can't travel abroad? And I think it's still, I've barely scratched the surface in this book about over what he did during that period to actually evade and upset statecraft, right?
Yes.
And and it's still fantastic, even the little bit that I've come into contact with, right? So I do think you're absolutely right around this question of fugitivity, and it's one that I think we've yet to kind of fully grapple with in understanding the multimodalities of it all, and the ways in which, what if we take the body out of the equation? What then are we left with as far as forwarding this theorization and this practice? What does it make available to us that the body actually kind of obscures? That the body, we know all of the detainment capabilities, or many of the detainment capabilities of the state, but what else is there? There's so many other opportunities for this. And this is part of why I love that installation, right, where the Box Brown history is reanimated through the voices in the boxes in the crates, right? The man who folded himself small enough to fit in a parcel to escape enslavement. Then those same dimensions being used to create boxes in a gallery space that then are filled with Black voices, including Paul Robeson's, right? What the body can evade, the excess of the body, right? The voice is always still the body, but it's in excess of it. So what can the voice do that the body can't in working against those kinds of detentions? And I think he needs to be a central figure in continual theorization of Black fugitivity. Absolutely.
I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Jazz, I'm not even gonna try to crystallize what you were gonna think through, Jazz. I'm just gonna ask you to unmute and do it.
That's not a good sign. Okay, so I think oh, hi, Redmond, by the way.
Hi.
Very excited to have you here. Thank you for taking time out of your schedule. You already kind of touched on a little bit, what I wanted to ask, but maybe not exactly in the amount of detail, with talking about the recording at the Bandung conference and how that was like just his voice, like his speaking voice rather than his singing voice. And I guess like you conceptualize this thing called voice, right, with a capital V.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess I'm wrapping my head around that. And my question, like, I'm going to ask you my question, and then as you were talking, I was jotting down like 5 different aspects to this thing with a capital V voice that I've interpreted from what you've said and from your book,
Mm-hmm.
which I really loved, by the way. So my question is, how much further from Robeson could we stretch the concept of voice? So you like obviously conceptualized voice very specifically in this very specific context relating to him, but like it obviously relates and can relate to other things, other people, right? Other vocalizations. So
Mm-hmm.
what are the necessary components that make up capital V voice? And in what circumstances does it appear? That is, and I guess this is my understanding of voice, that is a vocality that enhances the possibilities for liberatory presence and futures.
Mm-hmm.
Does regular regular speak differ from voice? And what about other things like political orations, protest chants, spoken word poetry, even things like screamo punk music,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the question. And I'll just quickly say the 5 bits of voice that I think I've so far understood as being part of this definition of voice. And I guess I'm wondering, like, is that accurate to what you were trying to explain? And how many elements of these things need to exist for something to be capital V voice? So one, I wrote that it occupies a temporality within insurgent movements and liberatory struggles, meaning it is within and of the movement rather than simply just being about the movement. Two, it comes through a vocalist that is actively engaged in struggle. Three, the content relates to justice, so the actual lyrics and stuff, and the sounds. Four, it comes through a vocalist with lived experiences of anti-Black violence and racial colonial violence. And then five, it contains possibilities and reaches for participation and transference. So those are like the elements, and I was just wondering, like, if you understand my question, I'll stop ranting and just let you make sense of that.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. I love those 5 categories. I want to say yes to all of them, that all of that is present, certainly in my rendering of this language in relationship to Robeson. I think the third one is where we might have some debate. So the question of whether or not it is a requirement that the music used by the vocalist lyrically and musically represent or explicitly identify some kind of political struggle or circumstance. I think that's an open question for me, and I say that because part of the pushback that Robeson received, particularly early in his career as he's performing the Negro spirituals in the 1920s, was that these were songs that African descended peoples wanted to do away with, right? That the Black middle class was upset with him for using these songs in the ways in which he was using them, because they saw themselves as thoroughly modern, emancipated peoples. Why would we go back to the spirituals? That's just setting us back. And also the fact that they were not tuned to the kind of not only aspirational ambitions of modern Black identity, but that they were just out of sync with the ways in which people listened at that moment, right? Kind of being gripped in this popular moment by the blues and by jazz in particular. Robeson's argument, in part, was that this was the music of our ancestors and we needed to honor them, but also that this was the music that connected us to the rest of the world, right? This pentatonic relationship to the global South in particular. And he found deep intellectual, but also emotional resonance and significance in that fact. And that it was for those reasons that these were the songs of struggle of our people, that we needed to keep them alive, and that they would always have a place in our repertoire, not to mention the fact that he was directly impacted by enslavement. His father had been enslaved, right? He knew that materially. He heard the stories from his father, and he understood those traditions in ways that others could not perhaps have touched or understood. Those songs in and of themselves, right? As we study the history of the spirituals, we know that there was a lot of code and innuendo in those songs, right? They're not going to be slapping you in the face with political adage or sound bites, right? These are going to be songs that are far more subtle because they are meant to be maps to an imagined future, to a new place that, if found out, would have meant death for those who carried it, right? So those kinds of songs, and it's similar in other kinds of folk traditions, right? The songs that he was singing in other languages were not necessarily songs that were explicitly anti-state or anti-oppression or anything like that, but they were the songs of people who were radically dispossessed by capitalism, by colonial exploitation, all of these things, right? So by simple virtue of reviving and bringing to the main stage these songs, there was already an inherent kind of political ethic and attachment to these songs, particularly as he's singing them in the original language. So I think that's where the third kind of condition gets a little bit dicey, because you're not always going to read on the surface of these songs a political investment, right? It really ends up becoming more about what I argue in my first book around Anthem, right? You know these songs by their use. You know where you know their political import and significance by where they show up. And so I think that's the bit of nuance that I would bring to that third category, but those are spot on. You're exactly right in your reading. So the earlier portion of your question, I may need you to repeat.
Well, I think you basically answered
About
it.
capital V voice.
Yeah, capital V voice. I guess like, yeah. I mean, you kind of, I guess I was struggling to find examples of something similar to Robeson, right? Someone else similar to like all the work that he does, or the capital V voice that you're talking about. But I think in your discussion, I just kind of realized also that that's probably in large because I mainly understand English, right? And his way was very much like a global so-called South vibe, where, you know, like much more apparent in Latin American revolutionary tracks, or like the Caribbean or Africa or the Middle East. And I guess we lack that a little bit in the West, maybe.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say first that I think it could be applicable to other vocal traditions and practitioners. I think it could be applicable to other creatives, right? Capital V voice is most interested in us really grappling with seriously both matter and circumstance as we're engaging with our vocalists, right? The matter of the body, the grain of the voice, timbre, all of those musicological readings of what we're hearing, but also the circumstance, knowing the voice in the world, because those things are never separate, right? Even with the bread and circuses of US pop music, those things are never separate. So we actually have to hold them together. So I think it's an applicable theorization. It just is not as robustly revealed in other people. There has been no other Paul Robeson. And I can say that definitively, right? There have been other really important vocalists. I've studied many of them and listened to many of them and loved dearly many of them, but there has only ever been him. But thinking through that, again, as a means of articulating how he was composed. He is an aggregate person. There are many pieces of him that come together to form that voice, capital V. And so knowing all of those people, knowing all of those communities, those investments, those commitments is what actually makes him so fantastic.
I just had to take a note in the chat that just echoed in my mind as you spoke. Natasha, you had something you wanted to bring forward about quiet, and I can't wait to hear this. Go ahead, Natasha.
Hi, thank you so much for your book. It is really inspiring. It made me feel like more free, more creative. It made me want to sing. I haven't done it yet, but
That's the best compliment. Thank you.
I just loved, yeah, moving through it. So thank you for your book. Yeah, I'm a PhD candidate in political theory, so some of my questioning is kind of related to that. And actually, this kind of response you had to Jazz just now is a very nice segue, where you say that you know he's composed by kind of, he is a collective, you say in the intro. And I wanted to ask how you think about the component of interiority that you discuss, like using this person Quaishi's concept of, I had never read this person before, but I thought it was so beautiful. This person's concept of like interiority and quiet. And that, you know, the self and the interiority, this is not apolitical, and that there is a sovereignty there. And also that at the same time, this is a person who is a collective. I guess I'm just curious, like how it seems to me that the interiority of the self is in some ways like isolated. Like especially when I think about the kind of like depression he was going through, and whether in those moments of depression is he a collective in the same way that he was in other moments. Especially like because I think there's a lot of discourse about, transforming ourselves in order to transform our conditions and to generate new worlds. Yeah, like this is hadn't really thought it through, but that's kind of like what I was thinking about, the tension between him as a collective and the interior space. And really the question about quiet was also related to trying to understand like what is the quiet here. Like this kind of comes up when he's providing responses to the chairman and Mr. Ahrens of the House Committee on Un-American Activities. And was it that he's invoking the Fifth Amendment, or is there something more to strategies of quiet that I would like to know more about? So those are just some thoughts. And also I had another question that you can answer or not answer, which was like, how did you feel transformed by working on this book? Like, was there something? Yeah, that's the question.
I love that question, and I'm happy to answer it. Absolutely. I'll start with the first one. So I'm picking up on this beautiful, beautiful theorization from my friend Kevin Quashie, whose book is titled The Sovereignty of Quiet. And in it, he's interested in thinking beyond those moments of kind of hypervisibility of the Black power fist, of the chants in the street. He's trying to think Black political life in offstage moments, those moments that we're not reading about in the movement histories, those moments that we're not listening to on the record, all of those moments. And this is the kind of grace that I want to give Robeson to, right? And this is just harder to trace. The archive is not giving us those moments unless we're bringing to our kind of witness and reading practices a kind of critical wildness, which is what I am trying to do in this project and continues to now animate my work beyond it. There was a moment in the archive. He has papers at Howard University, and I remember being there and looking through those papers and finding one of his passports there, right? And knowing how central the passport was to who he was as a creative and a thinker and a citizen, but also knowing how it was weaponized against him, and just being able to flip through it, to hold it in my bare hands, to flip through it. There was kind of a peace, P-E-A-C-E, in that artifact that for me felt like a part of this quiet, that he loved to travel. And Barbara Ransby, who wrote a biography of his life partner, Islanda Good Robeson, writes in there that as much as she and Paul traveled, and they traveled the entire world for decades, right? As much as they traveled, they were never a tourist. They were always in these places with purpose and with meaning and in service of creating relationships. It wasn't just gawking or spectatorship. They were there for real, with a mission, right? And so I've felt these moments in kind of confrontation, but also communion with elements of his archive, being in places, for example, being in places where he's been or where he's sung, right? I speak, I think in the conclusion, about visiting a cathedral in London where he was the first lay person to sing from the pulpit, right? And it was in service of a benefit drawing attention to the incarceration of Nelson Mandela, right? That there are moments of being in that place and thinking about how his vibration matched or was repelled by the stained glass in that cathedral and what the boys' choir was doing at that moment as he prepared to step to the dais. Like all of these things are these moments that I really wanted to sit with, even if I could only bring a cursory language to those moments, or these moments where he's in retirement in Philadelphia and being in his bedroom that has been somewhat preserved in original form, but knowing that the window faces west and that there's also a window facing south, and the south facing window faces the train tracks. And what did that, as someone who played John Henry, what did that mean for him to be facing the railroad tracks in his personal bedroom as he's retired and watching the civil rights movement proper kind of, you know, flash before his eyes on television, and making a very principled stance when the rare reporter came to him to ask him about, well, what would you tell the young activists today? What are they doing wrong? And him saying they're doing nothing wrong. This is their moment and they are doing what they need to be doing, and I fully support them, right? And I imagine like him slamming the door in the reporter's face, right? For having goaded him into an attempted kind of criticism or scolding of these younger activists, right? So I wanted to mark these moments. I wanted to mark the stained glass in his window. I wanted to think about all of these things that we don't understand as audible or sonic, and to bring that dimension back to them, because his body is in these places, that the residue of all of his vibration is in these places. And again, some of it is speculative. And that was, to get to your second question, that was probably the joy of writing this book. It was both getting to know him better and feeling like I was in deep conversation with him always, that I was talking to him and he was talking to me. But then in addition to that, the great joy was in being able to play and experiment with ideas in ways that I think are, or in a way that is less and less encouraged in the corporate university. And in order to tell a story about people far in excess of this single man, because I think I'm telling a story about Palestine in this book. I'm telling a story about South Africa in this book. I'm telling a story about Jim Crow US in this book, right? All of these places that are on my mind and my heart, and that he gave me the opportunity to think through in a different kind of way, that I was able to project through him into these spaces where he otherwise could not be, but wanted to go. And so I think the speculative element of this, I hope I've done it with both enough curiosity and enough care that it's compelling to the reader, but more than that, that it's pleasing to him, because I think about him as a reader of this work as well, and hope that he's smiling.
Oh, it's beautiful. In our last 13 minutes, I'm hoping that we can get our folks in here catalyzing rather than concluding. But Jonesy, let's bring you in, and then from Jonesy we'll go to Leslie and Susie, and then we'll call it a point of departure for the day after that.
Thank you. I'm not an academic. I just feel like saying that up front because I am an abolitionist with anarchist tendencies. So I feel like I'm like wandering into a space where I'm not even familiar with where I might be offending hierarchies and deference. So I apologize in advance.
Go for it.
Loved reading this book.
Oh.
Your joy in the archive. Like I was talking to someone about, like I call my mom up. I'm like, I need to talk about this book right now. And I'm like, I feel like she was just like in the archive and finding all this really cool stuff. And she was just like, I need to invent a thesis just to get all this information out there. Like
that was kind of it. Yeah, you got it.
I loved it. I also found it extremely challenging because I took you very seriously at the beginning when you said this is not a biography. And the longer it went on, the more I was like, this is a hagiography. And I should throw in at this point that I was born and raised Catholic. I operate from a liberation theology place. You know, so like I do believe I'm not like a 100% materialist. And this tracks. And I'm sitting here and we've been having this whole conversation and everyone's like, oh, this is such a unique methodology. And this is all these things. And I'm like, no, this is 2000 years old. This is like exactly what the Catholic Church has been doing, like with this exact same mission of like taking a person and communalizing their time on earth. I mean, like there were like, it was freakish, like down to the disappearing casts of the sculpture. Like, where do relics of saints come from? Like, people want to capture part of the body. Like, we talk about the voice. The voice is the Holy Spirit. You know, there's just this whole level of irrationalist, and I don't use that as an insult, but I don't know how that fits in or if that's even dealt with in academia at all. But I was just really struck by how much that tracked. And as someone who's always been kind of uncomfortable with saintdom, probably because, you know, grew up in the era of like Mother Teresa, who was just a horrible fucking human being, but was always like, they would extract out the parts that were useful. So I'm like just extremely sensitive to how we pull these stories out. So it's like I'm 100% on board with your project to communalize this and collectivize it. But I was also just haunted by the fact of this is not a new methodology. This is a very old methodology, and it's very easily like grafted onto an oppressive structure. And so, I mean, I guess I just kind of want to ask, like, I have no idea if, like, is that just my own weird background of knowing about that? If that was, like, any part of, like, everybody else was talking about hagiography as if, like in a very academic sense, but really as, like, a religious meaning-making project, hagiography, like, the communion of saints. Like, there are a lot of positive parts to that without getting tied into the like, oh, by the way, we're like just this horrible colonizing, spirit destroying institution. Like there, it's not. So yes, I mean, I wanted to ask about that, but I also just wanted to throw in that I live in Kansas City. The Negro Leagues Baseball Museum is here. It has been like a heavily contested site of history, meaning, position. And I also live a couple blocks from where Satchel Paige, his home was, that he bought with his earnings. And for people who don't know, Satchel Paige was kind of like the anti-Jackie Robinson. He was arguably like, I mean, he was an extremely talented baseball player who had zero tolerance for deferring to white people. And everybody in the Negro Leagues was like, oh, he's going to be the first guy to cross the color barrier. And the people doing it were like, yeah, no, there's no way we're putting Satchel Paige into this position. And there is a project, a long ongoing project to turn his house into a museum and kind of turn that into a whole project. And, you know, he has family members who still live in the neighborhood. And like everything that you were saying about the family, like it was so present to me. Well, like while I was reading it, I was like, maybe I'm like just completely out on a limb, but this totally sounds like what we're dealing with Satchel Paige's family and how he's been used and how angry they are. And I don't know if that is useful to you in any way, but it like resonated really strongly. So I wanted to share it with you that like, yes, Paul Robeson was exceptional, but also like, yeah, this is definitely universal and this is everywhere. And so I wanted to share that. I wanted to ask a question, but also just wanted to say that like everything you were talking about, and that really came across in the way you were writing, was that sensitivity to the family and like, how do you tell the story without hurting their sense of what honestly comes down to ownership, which is like an intimate level of their father who's being pulled out into other places. So thank you.
Yeah, and for a family that was already so familiar with sharing their grandfather and their father, right? These families who have these kind of spectacularly talented family members who then they feel are being shared by everyone in the world, right? So not wanting them to be pulled apart by these masses, right? Like some kind of ravaged piece of meat, right? That they actually are able to be preserved and be whole as they're in their final rest, right? Like do not besmirch, do not misrepresent, do not sacrifice any further my family for your purposes, right? And they are used for political purposes so often. And that was a big part of my reading of the stamp, right? Like I just think it was a bad move, right? Politically, as you could probably tell from my reading of it. First, I want to say thank you for reading the book and sticking with it. I wrote it perhaps not recognizing the difficulty of it, right? But people have shared with me, like, I loved it, but it was hard. And I'm proud of that on the one hand. On the other hand, that's part of why I wanted to announce it wasn't a biography, because I think people kind of just may randomly pick up biography and be like, oh, I'll learn something. This will be straightforward. That is not how I write. It's not how I think. So I really appreciate the compliment and the compliment of you sticking with it and drawing it into your own experiences and your own knowledges, because I do think in the academy, we are trained to believe there is something called objectivity, and we need to actually distance ourselves from the subjects of whom we write, of the communities of whom we write, of the ideas about which we write. And I wanted to be really clear in this project that I don't have any critical distance from this person. Like, I love this person. And I hope that that comes through in the writing, but I hope that it also has immense value for the ways in which people understand the world and understand power in the world. And I think those two things don't have to be at odds at all. I think the ways in which the hagiography claim was brought to my attention as I was workshopping the work, it was a bit of an indictment. It was like precisely what you're saying around sainthood, right? How do we actually represent this person fairly? Meaning kind of what we're faced with in these political times, this kind of both sides BS, right? Well, if you're going to tell me so many good things about him, I need you to tell me some bad things too. And I don't think it's that simple. Ever, but especially with a person like Robeson, right? His villainy really is attached to his communism most often. That's not my political position, so I'm not interested in making that argument. But I think the hagiography, such as you frame it, is really helpful and useful for me. I grew up Protestant, so I do not know the Catholic tradition in the ways in which you know it, right? I think actually the ways in people create saints out of need. And I hope that the need I'm forwarding, the needs of these communities who created this person called Paul Robeson, I see those needs as valiant. I see those needs as urgent. I see those needs as still present in really profound ways. And I don't think that need is an error on their part at all. I think it's the ways in which dispossessed, minoritized people survive. But I also do want to be mindful of the ways in which the stories may be in excess of what these people can actually do in the world. Like, let's not make more work for him by making him outsized to what any individual might possibly accomplish, right? So even with the title, Everything Man, right? This was initially tongue-in-cheek, but it is also the case, and this was my response to the hagiography concern, is that there's nothing that I've written in this book that I can't prove. So even all of these moments that seem fantastic to us, this moment during the Spanish Civil War where he sings on the battlefront and the opposing forces lay down arms in order to communally listen to him sing, that really happened. He really paused a war, right? So I think that, yes, there's a kind of fantastical element to the way that I might frame some of these things, and certainly in the way that I curate the information in the book. There's some, kind of almost inexplicable kinds of energies that might arise from the ways in which I curate the information in the book. But like you said, I was in the archive. I was playing. I was having fun. I was enjoying those moments because I felt like he was sitting there with me and he was telling me things. Put these two things together. Or don't pay attention to that, or reread the conversation that Baldwin and other folks had about this issue over here, right? That he was guiding me in particular kinds of ways. And I felt really solid in everything that I wrote in that book. Even if I took some license at certain moments, I still would say to this day that I stand behind everything there and can prove everything that I wrote in that book. So I mentioned his granddaughter having written a children's book about him, and it was actually about this moment on the during the Spanish Civil War, and it's called Grandpa Stops a War. That sounds fantastical, but it really happened, right? And I think it's part of this. I have this Benny Green quote from 1960, right, where the hero is not fashionable at the moment. I think part of it is also our cynicism and the contemporary political circumstance in which we live. It's hard for us to believe in heroes. And I think we have to keep some critical relationship to heroes, because a lot of them are outsized, are recreated in ways that are not beneficial to our movements or to that person's legacy. But sometimes we have to let a hero be a hero. And we have to actually sit in that energy and in that possibility in ways that then make for other futures. Right? We need those futures. We need to survive this present, and we need those futures. And those people might be equipped to help us get there. So thank you for that. That's really helpful.
Folks, we started a little late, so we're going to run a little late, and I hope that's okay. Folks got to go. Please don't hesitate. Don't feel like you're being rude, but I do want to close out with a couple thoughts shared kind of in dialogue with Leslie and Susie, and then we can close out with Shana responding to their thinking. So I think Leslie makes sense for maybe you to go and then Susie to follow up, and then we'll throw it to Shana.
Okay, thank you so much. Shauna, thanks so much for being with us. It's really nice to be in community with you. And I want to thank you too for, I'm grateful for the opportunity to have kind of come back around to Paul Robeson. I'm really someone who specializes in the 18th and 19th century, so I don't get to dabble that much in the 20th century, but Robeson has always been someone I've been really interested in and fascinated with. And I sometimes think, my most recent work has been on Haiti. And one of the things that I often think about is how the Haitian Revolution has been sort of written out of the history of the global Black freedom struggle. And I feel like, it's only talked about sort of in the far most left radical, wings of the movement. And I kind of feel like I sometimes feel the same way about Paul Robeson, that he, in some ways, I think because of his, views on class and his associations with the Communist Party, that like he has also been sort of written out of the story of the global Black freedom struggle. So I'm grateful to people like you who are trying to, bring it back, bring him back into the conversation and, refocus our attention on the significance of him and his contribution to the movement. I had a couple of questions for you, and I'll try to keep them brief because I know we're running low on time, but I'm a historian, so they're kind of historian-related questions, even though I realize your project is doing much more than that. But one of the questions that I had was that I was interested in the early part of the book about a choice that you make to draw a parallel between him and Frederick Douglass. Because, and so I guess the question is like, I'm curious about the choice of Douglass, because one of the things, as you said, that really strikes me about Robeson is that he was so principled and he was so like grounded in his political philosophy. And Frederick Douglass was very like wishy-washy and like went with the wind, you know what I mean? And I don't think his politics were ever as radical, as Robeson's, but he was also just kind of a wishy-washy character. Anyway, I'm curious about like the choice that you made to draw a parallel between the two of them. And then the other hopefully quick question that I had is just if you had any thoughts about the role of like his birth family in shaping him. This book is really a lot about the communities that he's a part of and the communities that he contributes to. But again, probably just from the perspective of a historian, like his birth family is really fascinating. I'm saying this, but I'm saying this to some of the people who might not know that, his mother is from this very kind of like progressive abolitionist Black Quaker family. And they had been sort of involved in like radical abolitionist politics and had been very influential kind of in Black politics. And then, as you mentioned, obviously his father had self-emancipated himself, right? Was a fugitive, and then obviously goes on to have this really interesting career. I've read only a little bit about his siblings, but it seems like they go on to lead interesting lives too. So just curious, like if you have thoughts about his role, right? In terms of that being a community that he was part of, you know what I mean? His interaction with those folks as a community, but then also the influence that those folks and, some of his other family members might have had on who he became. And I guess just quickly as a transition to what Susie was going to say, what I said before you came in is that I kind of feel like the only point of connection between Robeson and Frederick Douglass was that they were both known or accused to have been womanizers. And so, that'll sort of lead to Susie's questions, but, I'm kind of interested in your thoughts about if we think the personal is political, you know what I mean? What we sort of think of some of his personal activities, shall we say.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where the sainthood starts to fall apart most concretely, so we can talk about that, although, I pass no judgment, right? And actually he and Islanda at a certain point had a very clear agreement in their marriage about what both of them were going to do, right? So
okay, I wondered about that. I didn't know the details of that, but that was actually something I was curious about that.
Yeah, so Barbara talks about that in her biography of Islanda, right? About the agreement that they made in their marriage about seeing other people and the kinds of lives they wanted to lead with one another. So, as it started out as something that may have been nefarious or certainly was not consensual within the bounds of their marriage, but ultimately grew into something that they agreed upon, right? And both participated in. So it's complicated, but ultimately seemed very ethical to me at a certain point in their marriage, right? I'm sure it was a difficult road to get there, but I'm certain of it. But they got there. The relationship to the Douglass really was an opportunity for me to kind of set up this thematic framework for the project, right? So the specific quote that I use as epigraph to the opening of the book, the element preface to the book, it really was the language that Douglass offered that made the connection for me, and the fact that I had seen Robeson reference Douglass in various of his own personal writings, right? He was someone who Robeson read. And also the other connection between them that I would make is that they were both known orators, right? Fantastic orators with a kind of command of language that was well in excess of what was expected of Black men in their time, right? So I think, yes, I agree with you completely about his political wishy-washiness. That said, he was still revered by people like Du Bois, like Robeson, and this kind of circle of intellectual at this moment. So I think I'm less interested. I'm not even so interested in drawing him into that genealogy, right? Like thinking about that there being some kind of progression, but actually thinking about the kinds of ideas that Douglas is forwarding in his oratory are the kinds of revelations of self and creation that Robeson was manifesting, that he was able to take some of the wind from Douglas's oratory and make it real in the world, right? So that's part of the connection that I'm trying to build there. And it's not meant to be perfectly robust, just because you're right about Douglas, and I don't want to make a fault. There's no equivalency or any of that. It really is just trying to put some historical perspective to where I think Robeson came from, right? If he is elemental, then what then existed before he came to the surface? And so this was one opportunity for me to kind of tap into that. As far as his family is concerned, that's a great question. And I don't know a ton about his family, actually. I knew about his mother's background, but what you described is about as much as I know, right? And she passed away in a devastating home fire when he was 5 years old. And so he really knew and was raised by his father, and he revered his father. Any opportunity, it seems to me, he got in personal interviews to talk about him, he did. He talked about him being the most fantastic orator he had ever heard in his life, right? And he's part of the inspiration behind Robeson going on to debate club at Rutgers, being valedictorian, all of these things, right? Is because his father insisted on all of this. And it was a very close relationship too, because Robeson was the youngest of 5, and he had his father all to himself for quite a bit of time. There was quite a bit of an age gap between himself and his other siblings. So he was at home alone with his reverend father, and watching his father both as a leader in his church and in the Princeton community before they moved into northern New Jersey, but also seeing all of the despicable instances that his father faced in relationship to Princeton University, for example, or in relationship to the city, right? So he saw both the terror and the incredible talent that his father had and withstood. And I know that was formative for him. He wanted to be his father, right? Even as he recognized the pulpit was not for him. His brother Ben was that person in the family, and he led, the Riverside Church for a long time. His older brother, and it was at that church that he would make some of the most important of his speeches, but also important of his performances during that 50-58 moment when he couldn't travel, right? He would go to his brother's church, and he would always have a stage available to him. So he would sing, he would make speeches, and his brother supported him in all of this. So in that respect, his family really showed up. And then he lived his final decade of life with his older sister, Marianne, in Philadelphia. That was her house. That is now the Paul Robeson house. And he describes her as just an incredibly warm and generous person, and she cared for him in his final years. So they were, again, this question of quiet. Like, his family, as significant as they were in their communities, were the quiet parts of his life. And I think there was a certain comfort in that retreat back to his family in the 50s and 60s that served him really, really well.
Thank you, Shana. Thank you for staying extra.
Hey, of course.
I'm gonna hook you up when I see you in a couple weeks with a bonus.
Appreciate that, but I can't talk about him enough, so I'm happy.
I know, I can tell, right? Susie, you and Shana bring us home.
You're muted.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Thanks so much for sharing your work with us. I wanted to actually talk about something that Joni said about just pick up on the hagiography. And I thought, and also some things that you said, which is people create saints out of needs, or that when you've been accused of hagiography, that you have seen it as an indictment. And I think this is really interesting, because I would say that that's kind of a misreading, because I think that the idea of when people say it's an hagiography, this is how I saw it, is that it's seen as an indictment because it's like saying that your version of this saint is not balanced, right? But actually, what I think is being said is that the saint is actually not the subject of your book. To me, that to say that it feels like a hagiography is really asking the question, what are you really writing about? And so I was thinking about this because we read Eric Stanley's book earlier in the semester. And he talks about Martha Johnson and Sylvia Rivera. And one of the things that really struck me about his analysis is that, you know, these are two iconic women activists, right? But when he says we put them up as icons, we reify them. And in fact, they themselves would have rejected it, that they kind of escape the messiness. He really like focuses into like messiness. And I think that this was like a political position. And I think that to reify Robeson, or even say that he was not, this is not about him, this is about what he is. I was thinking, what would a queer reading look like? Particularly because the way in which he was given like power and capital in American society, like his voice, he was a bass, he was very physically big, he was beautiful, like his body, you know, the statue, like all of those things, it's very heteronormative and it's highly racialized, right? And so I felt like, you know, like what would actually a queer reading of him look like? And because that doesn't happen, and I know that you don't want to reify him, clearly, right? So I felt like if I really think about what I think your book is about, I feel like the only way to actually escape this reification, which clearly I think you do not want to do, is, to me, it's very clear that your book is about you, that you are writing about yourself and your idea, frankly, about liberation, you know? And I expected to see more of you in the book. The fact that you dedicated, who I can only imagine, to your child, who you named after him, says to me that this is a book about you. Like, to me, like all your answers so far have been answering questions about Robeson's life. But to me, this book is about you and how you see, right, a future, a possibility, and you're basically like using him as a vehicle. I think the way to get out of that, to me, this is like, maybe this is the prelude to your next book, which is about you. And if you think that the story is about Palestine, you think that the story is about Gaza, then that's the story that you're telling, then I think you need to tell it in all of its materiality, rather than like gesturing to it. Again, Leslie, I'm a historian. So this may be totally out of bounds in terms of like the meeting of our disciplines. But like one of the best things I thought about your book was when you talk about in your intro. So like the first time I thought this feeling is in the preface on page 16, when you said, why is he back? Right? This is a question you asked. What are the conditions? I wrote in the thing, I was like, he's back because you conjured him, right? So he's back because you found him. You found all the traces of him. So clearly it comes from you. And then in the intro on page 12, you said, in fact, you're like, that those who call him and others back from the brink of obscurity see their present as a continuation of. And to me, that's the kind of genealogy actually that you're creating, right? But if you only focus on him and then try to elide that you're actually talking about him by saying that it's not a biography, it comes off very much as like mission accomplished, where really it's not really talking to me about like who is the subject. And that subject is you, like the hope that you have, the ideas for liberation that you have, like the person literally that you are in this historical moment, not in the past, could be influenced, inspired by this other figure who you admire so much. Doesn't really matter actually if we get to know who he is, because that may be just it's so elusive. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And it's a really important challenge. I mean, I make no I don't hide the fact that this book is actually about trying to understand the political present, right? And I think reading myself more thoroughly into that political present, meaning the things that I'm invested in this political present, is absolutely right. Like, I'm interested in how we get free. And I think that this is one of those methodologies for that possibility, right? That we call back our ancestors, the people who never left us, in order to provide us new perspective, new inspiration for moving forward. And that the music is always there, that the music is constantly running in anticipation of and successful kind of completion of whatever task is in front of us, right? So it absolutely is about the political present. And this was part of my resistance to the biography. And I do think there is some queerness in that, right? Because this is a book that is about multiplication without reproduction, right? Without the kind of normative acts of disciple formation, of, you know, it's about reproduction, reproducing the political terms and stakes of struggle without actually trying to think about it institutionally, or to think about it as something that might be kind of normatively conceived, right? What are the other kinds of metaphysical processes by which we get closer to moving forward these long genealogies of struggle? And so I do think there's a queerness that's available there, but I take that challenge really seriously, because I was concerned about that. I was concerned about writing a book about a straight man, right? Martin Duberman aside, who has suggested that Robeson was queer and things like that. I was worried about that from the outset, right? And this was part of my thinking in making him multiple. It was not the primary motivation, because that is just the way I understand him, but it was on my mind. And so how to actually navigate that, part of the way that I felt I was doing that was by having myself in there, even the little bit that I do, right? Talking about learning the theremin or other encounters with him, the other things that he made me do, right? And this is in answer to the question of what did I learn from doing this project? I learned that our people make us do things in order to be better equipped to answer their call, right? I had to learn how to play certain instruments. I had to learn how to look in other places. I had to do these things because I was forced to contend with the tasks put in front of me that, you know, could not have solely been of my design, right? I conjured him, as you said, and I appreciate that, because I do feel that way. And then because of that, he was now here and made me do certain things. But I think there is, you know, the next project that I'm working on is forcing me to write myself in a certain kind, in even more explicit way than this project. And I think you're right, that this book was meant to lead me to that kind of narrative voice. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for having to struggle through the pretense of objectivity with this project to allow myself to be wild in certain ways so that I could get to the project that I'm writing now, which forces me to again deal with the political present, but in ways that are deeply intimate to who I am and what I know and how I move in the world. And so I think those kinds of requests are really, really important. And he helped me to get there, but these communities helped me to get there. So in that respect, yes. And I don't want to, the comments from Joni are not the kinds of indictments that I'm speaking of. There was just one, I was giving this work at Ohio State, and someone was kind of flip in their use of the language of hagiography. And so I take what Joni said tonight very seriously. This other person, not so much, but I think it's really about understanding it again in the world in which we need these people. We need them to stay with us, and we need them to continue teaching us about how we best survive this moment. And so, yes, it is my child to whom the book is dedicated, and it is me on every page of this book, whether I use first person or not. And I hope that I know for me, it's been a transformative experience in thought and practice, but I hope for readers, it becomes something that might allow for a similar license in whatever they're doing in the world.
You know, I think that part of what is the issue here is that, like you said, there's this kind of like expectation of materiality, you know, and because of the way in which objectivity is formed, like you're not supposed to be there. And I think we can just eschew that, but just by saying we are there, right? But there is this expectation of materiality that I think is being claimed to be traced. For example, like when Ta-Nehisi Coates goes around and talks in interviews about the message, and he says that he sees a connection between Jim Crow segregation and Palestine today, he's talking about a materiality, like not just like a metaphor, you know what I mean? Like, but literally like tracing step by step. And while you were talking, one of the things that you made me think of as a possibility, and I'm not a musicologist, but maybe this is another option of a structure, is that the materiality comes from the music, comes from the sound. You know, like that's the thing that can be traced. I study a lot of networks, and actually my first book was like a biography, but I also said it wasn't a biography. It was like about networks of relationships among bankers. And so I was thinking maybe that's what flows and that's what you can trace. And that clearly has a materiality, but it also brings in like the listener, like who's listening to it in the moment, live music, like these kinds of things. And I'm thinking that actually may be another structure where it can be interwoven with like, you know, I don't mean that to say, I think it would be fantastic if you write a book and it's basically about yourself and how you kind of came out of this project. But I also think it's entirely possible if you wanted to write just about like the music and the sound and the, you know what I mean? Not even just the performance, not being a musicologist, but I can imagine that that would be kind of like the link in a network that you could follow.
Well, yeah, and that seems, and that feels, and I know that to be as material as what Ta-Nehisi is doing, right? And that people learn that way far more often than they learn in the way that he's outlining these structural violences, right? Like, yes, we can be convinced both ways. And this next project is actually me listening in the homes and cars of Black families before fatal execution of no-knock warrants and traffic stops. And so this is the work of connecting all of these listening practices to statecraft and state violence. How do people live in these moments before untimely demise? How do they live and know before violence? And we know it through all of these musical practices and curative efforts. Curatorial efforts, right? So it is the materiality of the music that's linking all of these stories, but that is telling us about not just how we die, but how we live, right? So I'm in the story, but it really is about these musics. And so I see that as the driving element in so many of the stories or the curiosities that I have in the wider world. Like, how do people learn to survive? They learn it through these musical practices, through listening practices, through being together, sitting in the living room and listening to the latest drop from Tyler, the Creator, which is quite good for anyone who hasn't listened. It came out this week, right? So like these are the moments where we're learning about each other and the world in really profound ways, and this is how we're living. So with that as the focus, you're absolutely right. I think this is the only way for me to tell the kind of stories that you've rightly pointed out I am uniquely interested in telling. I'm uniquely implicated in telling certain of these stories too.
So can we thank my friend, my comrade, my teacher, Shana Redmond, for coming through, and thank you all and
Yes, thank you all.
ourselves for being, you know, reflecting back to Mr. Robeson, the enactment of a collective genius that I think just pops out in this book so well. So thank you, Shana, for
Thank you all.
everything you've offered today, and thank you everybody for staying almost half an hour over time. I appreciate you. Just a heads up again, next week we are not meeting for this, but hopefully you will come through, whether live stream or in person, for the UC People's Tribunal for Palestine. When we reconvene this experimental study session, it'll be November 18, and it will be Sarah Haley's book that we'll be discussing, which I can think of no better follow-up to the discussions we've been having than to read Sarah's book. So I'm looking forward to seeing everybody. Thank you, Shana. Love you.
Thank you.
All right. I'll see you all soon, okay?
Thank you.